Hello everyone. In 1812, Napoleon was at the pinnacle of his power. From France to Poland, the center of Europe had fallen under his control or under his influence. Only Great Britain, Scandinavia, and Russia remained out of his grip. His main army had more than 1,000,000 men, and it stood ready to crush any country that would defy his authority. This is the moment he chose to attack the last continental power still standing, leading his army into the invasion of Russia. No one knew it yet, but this campaign in Russia would be the beginning of the end. This empire he had built in 10 years would collapse even faster. This is what I'm going to tell you about tonight in this third and last part of the story of Napoleon. You will find links to parts 1 and 2 in the description, but you don't necessarily need to listen to them to follow tonight's story. In part 1, we relived the wars of the French Revolution, and we followed Napoleon's rise to power until the coup he took control of in 1799, establishing himself as the ruler of France. In part 2, I discussed how he defeated successive coalitions in a constant state of war until 1807, and his victory against the Fourth Coalition. We left the story after the Battle of Friedland, a decisive victory against Russia that forced the Tsar, Alexander I, to open peace negotiations. Tonight we will see how Napoleon kept expanding his empire until the peak of 1810 to 1812. We will also see how a side war erupted on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean between the United States and Great Britain. I will also tell you about the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal, the campaign of Russia, and the subsequent retreat of Napoleonic armies all the way from Moscow to Paris, his defeat and exile to the island of Elba, followed by his escape from Elba and a doomed attempt to take back everything he had lost, until the final defeat at Waterloo. So once again, we have a lot to explore. I have a lot to tell you. So please make yourself comfortable. Take a deep breath, and as you exhale, let the tension go in your neck and in your shoulders, even in your arms and legs. As always, you can find this story and download it in video or audio in various formats, or listen to it as a podcast on Patreon. If you wish to support this channel and contribute to the elaboration of this library of stories. You may have noticed that there are never any ad breaks in my videos, even at the beginning or in the end. This is thanks to the contributions of all my supporters on Patreon. You can also listen on streaming sites like Spotify or Apple Music. And to help you navigate the story, or return later if you fall asleep, there are timestamps in the first comment pinned under the video, or on the progress bar on your screen. And now that we are settled, off we go. We left our story at the end of the second part in 1807. In a bit more than 10 years, Napoleon Bonaparte had had a meteoric rise. Fueled by his military victories, his sense of propaganda to turn these victories into political capital, his ambition, his thirst for power, and quite a bit of luck too. He became a general, and as such he participated with other plotters, including his own brother, in a coup in 1799 that changed the regime to a kind of republican dictatorship, the consulate. But he kept climbing and had himself voted consul for life, and then he replaced his own regime in 1804 by an empire of which he became the first ruler, Napoleon I. All along these years, he fought against several coalitions of kingdoms, worried by the growing expansionism of France and by the risk to their social order that the French Revolution had introduced. We saw in the first two parts how the first and the second coalition were defeated by revolutionary France, and how the third and fourth coalitions were quickly crushed by Napoleon, with fast victories against Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Napoleon's trajectory didn't go without setbacks. Faraway expeditions to Egypt or Saint-Domingue, for example, that ended in failure. The French fleet was also dealt a big blow at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1804. But by 1807, Napoleon had consolidated his power. He had eliminated all his main opponents on the continent and installed his regime in France. He had just won a decisive battle against Russia at Friedland, and he was now ready to negotiate a peace settlement with the Tsar, Alexander I. The Russian army had been decimated by two main battles, at Eylau, which was an indecisive battle but very deadly on both sides, and even more at Friedland, which was a decisive victory for Napoleon. This didn't leave much room for negotiation for Tsar Alexander, but on the other hand, Napoleon was willing to turn Russia into an ally, and would be inclined to propose relatively lenient terms. He wanted an ally that could be on the other side of Europe, and would help keep in check Austria and Prussia, and maybe even help discourage Great Britain by cutting its trade connections to the continent and depriving it of potential allies. So, despite the war that had just taken place, the two emperors started negotiating on a relatively friendly basis, and they could agree on an alliance. France would gain a major ally with a frontier with Austria, and one that would participate in Napoleon's new project of blockading the United Kingdom by preventing it from trading with the whole continent. Russia would be spared losses of territories and gain time to recreate its armies. There was also an anti-British lobby in Russia that was hostile to Britain because of its commercial pressure around Russian ports and its past support to the Ottoman Empire, an archenemy of Russia. An alliance with France could also leave Russia hands-free with the Ottomans and another old enemy allied to the UK, Sweden. But Russia never embraced this alliance completely, because it was clearly unbalanced. Napoleon had recreated a state in Poland which Russia was strongly against. It was called the Duchy of Warsaw, and not Poland, but it was a clearly Polish state, and the mere existence of Poland was a problem for the Russians. There had been a time, 200 years earlier, when Poland-Lithuania had been a vital threat to Russia, the Duchy of Muscovy as it was called before it became Russia. This danger was long gone, but in the 18th century, Russia had participated with Austria and Prussia in the sharing of Poland. Each of them had annexed regions of Poland until the country disappeared completely. So seeing it recreated was in itself a setback and a risk of seeing Polish populations living in Russia revolt to rejoin this new Polish state. Another problem for Russia with this alliance was that Napoleon did not intend to share anything. There would be a Franco-Russian axis to solve all conflicts in Europe, but the zone of influence for Russia would be limited to its own territory, whereas the rest of continental Europe would be essentially allies and satellites of France, including Russia's direct neighbors. So the main advantage of this alliance was to stop the conflict immediately on rather favorable terms, despite the situation of weakness. But longer term, there was not much to take for Russia in this deal. The deal was quite unattractive. So from the moment this peace treaty and alliance were sealed, they are called the Treaty of Tilsit, after the place where Napoleon and Alexander met. The Russians had second thoughts, and these doubts only grew in the following years, because Napoleon kept expanding in Europe, and the cost of the continental blockade penalized the Russian economy. The idea of imposing an embargo on British goods had emerged several years earlier, after the plans to invade Great Britain had been dropped. At the time in 1804, the appearance of the Third Coalition meant that armies were needed to fight on the continent, and after the Royal Navy had strengthened its control of the seas following the Battle of Trafalgar, it became obvious that invading Great Britain would be, if not impossible, at least very difficult. Continental Europe as a whole was the main client for British manufactured and colonial goods. It accounted for 55% of British trade in 1802. And trade was crucial to Great Britain, not just for the profits it generated, but because Great Britain needed raw materials and increasingly food, because it was already in the early stages of changing from an agriculture-based to an industry-based economy. So that cutting all its trade connections could, in theory, lead to an economic collapse. For France and countries across the rest of continental Europe, sea trade was less crucial. They were self-sufficient for food. The British retaliated with a similar embargo that forbade ships from trading with France. Overall, this embargo, it is also called the Continental System, didn't work well. It only marginally reduced British trade. The British lost a lot of trade with Europe. Its share fell from 55 to 25% of their trade. But it didn't disappear completely, because smuggling grew exponentially, and some countries like Portugal, Spain, and Russia never really accepted to apply it. Having got rid of French, Dutch, and Spanish merchants, the British could compensate a large part of the decline in European trade in other parts of the world. So this embargo and the retaliation by the British didn't produce the intended results, but it had major consequences. It contributed to the opening of a new front in Spain and Portugal, an episode called the Peninsular War, and years later it was a factor behind the Anglo-American War of 1812 and the invasion of Russia by Napoleon too. We will talk about all this later. For the moment, let's take a look at the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal. I told you in previous parts how Spain had switched alliances after the War of the First Coalition. It had sided with France in 1795. At its frontier was Portugal, the oldest ally of England and then the UK. The alliance dated back from the 14th century. For this reason, the French pushed the Spanish to invade Portugal during the War of the Second Coalition, and in 1801 Portugal was invaded by much larger forces which it couldn't do much against. After this brief war, Portugal had to sign a treaty by which the country assumed a duty to close its ports to British trade. It was in fact bullied by Spain and France into cutting its ties to Britain. Due to the risk of having much bigger enemies at its frontier, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil in the 1800s. But despite the treaty, the Portuguese kept secret diplomatic relations with London, and they didn't enforce the embargo with a lot of zeal. In 1804, when the Battle of Trafalgar took place, the Portuguese were quite happy to see the Franco-Spanish fleet beaten, and the Third Coalition was forming on the continent, with Austria and Russia returning to war. So the king grew bolder and officially resumed trade and diplomatic relations with Britain. Unfortunately for Portugal, Trafalgar turned out to be the only major victory of the coalition in this war, and the continental enemies of Napoleon were crushed, one after the other, between 1805 and 1807. So when the situation in Central Europe was under control in 1807, Napoleon ordered another invasion of Portugal to punish it and finally enforce the Continental System. This invasion was the first step of a long-lasting war in the Iberian Peninsula, hence the name Peninsular War, that the French never managed to win because, contrary to the battlefields of Germany or Austria and Prussia, it turned into a war of guerrilla. In 1808, the year following the invasion of Portugal, it is Spain that revolted. Spain was still a traditional monarchy. It was even ruled by a branch of the Bourbon, the same dynasty that had lost the throne of France because of the Revolution. Spain was an ally to France, and the last of its neighbors that had not been turned into a satellite. Apart from Spain, Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands, had been annexed. The Netherlands turned into a puppet state, so had been German neighbors in the Confederation of the Rhine, the Swiss Confederation, the north of Italy. Spain was the last neighbor with a degree of political autonomy, and Napoleon was working on reducing this independence. French agents in 1807-1808 became heavily involved in Spanish affairs. They incited discord between the various members of the royal family and the various political factions in the country. These conflicts already existed before, but they were given enough importance to justify a French military intervention, officially to mediate between rival factions, in reality to reshape the regime to Napoleon's liking. A large army of 120,000 French troops was sent into Spain, officially to support the country, and it occupied Madrid. The king had abdicated, and his heir requested Napoleon's approval to take the throne. Both were summoned to the frontier with France, and they were convinced to abdicate. They were left with no other choice, after which Napoleon imposed his own candidate to the throne of Spain, who happened to be his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, because there's nothing like family. When I told you in earlier parts of this story that Napoleon was unable to win peace because he took too much, this is a good example, and his inclination to place his siblings on European thrones didn't end with Spain. He also did it on the throne of Naples in the south of Italy, and the kingdom he recreated in Holland. But instead of the smooth transition that had been expected and should have seen Spain fall in the orbit of France, things never stabilized. The Spanish population revolted against this occupation. The revolt started in Madrid and gained other cities, large and small, across the country. Years of repression began against passive resistance and guerrilla operations. They were supported, obviously, as much as possible by the British. The Spanish government had accepted Napoleon's decision to grant the throne to his brother, but the population never did, and the insurgency gained Portugal. In 1808, tens of thousands more French troops had to be sent to retake control of Spain. They won most of their engagements with small revolted armies, but suddenly they suffered a surprising defeat in the south of Spain at the Battle of Bailen. This battle against the Spanish army in revolt was not a huge fight. There were 20,000 to 30,000 troops on each side, but it was the first open field defeat of a Napoleonic army ever. So, in terms of image, it was a big blow to the reputation of invincibility on land that Napoleon's armies had established in the 1800s. It showed the force of national resistance, which ironically France had been the biggest proponent and heavily relying on in the 1790s, but that could now also play against France in occupied territories. The Battle of Bailen inspired resistance far beyond the frontiers of Spain, and it contributed to the creation of a fifth coalition, with Austria rejoining the conflict yet again. The British and the Portuguese landed armies and tried to coordinate an effort against the French. But at this point in 1808, Napoleon had his hands free. So he took command of a large army that crossed the Pyrenees, the mountains between France and Spain. And once again, he delivered a very efficient campaign in Spain that resulted in large revolted armies being eliminated and the British forced to evacuate. He then led tens of thousands of troops to occupy Spain in the hope that the rebels would be suppressed over time and that the population would end up accepting the new order. In 1809, a new coalition was rising against him and called for his presence in Central Europe. So he left Spain. But the country could never be pacified, and it remained a drain on the French army until a retreat by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Portugal was retaken by British and Portuguese armies. It served as a base for raids, and the Peninsular War raged for years, making more victims in Spain than any other conflict in modern history for the country. So, despite Napoleon's campaign in Spain, the Spanish theater had inspired Austria to return to war in 1809. The re-entry of Austria into the conflict is called the War of the Fifth Coalition. But like with Prussia and the Fourth Coalition 3 years earlier, it was just a continuation of the state of war, with just one belligerent more. On the side of the Allies, there were Austria, plus Great Britain and Spain and Portugal in revolt. But this time, contrary to previous coalitions, the numbers were not on the Allied side. In front of them, Napoleon had his army of hundreds of thousands, and he still had satellite states to support him, the Confederation of the Rhine, the republics created in Italy, the Netherlands, and the Duchy of Warsaw, plus German states like Saxony and Bavaria that had dropped their alliances with Prussia and Austria to join the side of France. From the start, the War of the Fifth Coalition didn't look good for the Allies, and indeed it ended in another disaster for Austria, and a costly one. So why did Austria join this war to begin with? The government was divided about it. Going to war with no other big ally looked like a reckless move. But on the other hand, there was the situation in Spain showing that hope was possible because Napoleonic armies were not invincible. There was also the hope of bringing more allies once Austria would be at war. And the Austrian army had also been reformed to adapt to modern warfare after its quite poor showing in the wars of the past 20 years, the almost systematic defeats against the French. And also, a large army had been kept mobilized after the Third Coalition, and this was very expensive. Public finances were doomed to crash if this army was not used quickly or disbanded. The idea of disbanding was repulsive for Austria, taken between France and Russia, so the army would have to be used. For these reasons, Austria went to war again, and regretted it quickly, but not before proving that Napoleon was not invincible, and that his domination of battlefields could maybe be challenged one day. The Austrians began their attack in Bavaria, allied with France, and it is in this region of Germany and around the Danube River that the war was decided. The concentration of Austrian troops in this region meant that they often were on a par or more numerous than the French that still had to occupy Spain and also defend the Netherlands from a British expedition, which they did. For the first time in 10 years, Napoleon was beaten in a large battle. It happened at the Battle of Aspern-Essling. Napoleon tried to cross the Danube, but superior Austrian forces drove his army back. He was able to regroup, and the Austrians could not exploit their victory. But for Napoleon this was an embarrassing setback, and everything was made to hide it from the public in France or across Europe. But this little flame of hope for the Allies was short-lived. Napoleon concentrated more troops and guns before trying another crossing 6 weeks later. And this time, he could win a decisive battle at Wagram. Once again, Austria had lost the majority of its forces, and it had to ask for peace. And this time the peace would be particularly harsh. It was the 4th time in 15 years that Austria had to ask for peace. The first time it had mainly lost the Austrian Netherlands, that is to say, modern Belgium. The second time, after the Second Coalition, the peace treaty only reaffirmed the territorial terms of the first, and yet again after the Third Coalition. But after the end of the Fifth Coalition, Napoleon had come to the conclusion that Austria had to be punished and hit near its heartlands to avoid yet another attack. In October 1809, Austria signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the summer palace of the Habsburgs near Vienna, in which it lost 20% of its population. The Adriatic coast, near Italy, was taken by France. A region to the north, Galicia, went to the Poles. The area of Tyrol and Salzburg in Austria went to Bavaria, and even Russia got a little piece in western Ukraine. The Austrians also had to pay a hefty war indemnity, and the daughter of Emperor Francis of Austria, Marie-Louise, would be married to Napoleon. This would be Napoleon's second marriage. He was never a big romantic, but since he was a young man, he had had relationships. As a young officer in the first years of the Revolution, he was engaged to the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Marseille in the south of France. In 1795, he met his future wife, Joséphine, in Paris. She is generally called Joséphine de Beauharnais, after the name of her first husband, who was a noble executed during the years of the Terror. She may have narrowly escaped execution herself, because she was incarcerated when Robespierre fell at the end of the most radical phase of the Revolution, the Terror. Joséphine was French but born in the West Indies, in the island of Martinique, in a family of planters. The family used to be relatively wealthy, but they lost most of their estate to hurricanes before the Revolution, and she was sent to France to marry Alexandre de Beauharnais, a wealthy aristocrat. In the years of the Revolution, except when she was imprisoned because of her husband, she became a kind of socialite in revolutionary Paris. She was beautiful, funny, cultured too. For all her life she was a lover and patron of the arts. And she collected lovers, living a life of happy widow. When Napoleon met her, He fell for her charm, and maybe also for her connections to members of the government and high-ranking generals. At the time he was on the rise, but not yet famous nor covered in glory by the campaign of Italy. This would happen in the following years. She also liked him, and her interest only grew with Napoleon's rise. There was probably sincerity in their relationship. They exchanged love letters for years when they were separated. But to gossipers in Paris, they were also a well-assorted couple of social climbers. Napoleon married her against the wishes of his family. They disliked her because she was older than him and for her reputation of having multiple lovers, which she didn't try to hide too much until Napoleon came close to supreme power. And also she made Napoleon's mother and sisters uncomfortable. They felt second class in her presence because she was sophisticated and witty, which they were not at all, arriving straight from Corsica to Paris. They at the same time despised her and felt belittled by her. But Napoleon didn't care, and he married Josephine, which didn't stop either of them from entertaining side relationships. And in the wake of her husband, she became like a first lady of France when he became first consul, and then Empress of the French from 1804. But she couldn't have children, a big problem for an empress in a now hereditary system. And of course her social background looked cheap for the wife of the new master of Europe. This meant that politically and diplomatically this marriage was useless at this point, even though Napoleon himself also had relatively humble origins. So Napoleon divorced her to be able to marry Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810, in the hope that this would seal the alliance with Austria after the Fifth Coalition and give him a heir. He got a son in 1811, but the Austrians would never let this royal marriage get in the way of their return to war, so politically it didn't bear fruit. So this is how Josephine was disposed of and replaced with Marie-Louise. Josephine remained in good terms with Napoleon and died before him in 1814, aged 51. Marie-Louise was 19 when she got married to Napoleon. She survived him after his fall, and she became Duchess of Parma in Italy, and the actual ruler of the duchy until her death in 1847. So, after the victory of Napoleon against the Fifth Coalition, his empire reached its peak in 1810. More territories were annexed to France, the Netherlands, and parts of North Germany, up to Hamburg, parts of Italy too, previously Austrian provinces on the Adriatic, which had the effect of landlocking Austria, and on the top of this, Napoleon had several satellite states or allies, like the Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Spain, even though it was in a state of revolt, the Kingdom of Naples in the south of Italy. War went on with Great Britain and in Spain, where it took the shape of a fight against the insurgency. Russia made peace with Sweden, taking Finland from it, and this took Sweden out of the war against Napoleon. At the same time, there was a succession crisis in Sweden, and the parliament, the Riksdag, chose to offer the regency and succession to the throne to one of Napoleon's marshals, Bernadotte. He accepted with Napoleon's agreement and later became King of Sweden, starting a new dynasty that still is on the throne of Sweden nowadays. But 3 years later, in 1813, Bernadotte turned against Napoleon and took Sweden back into the war against his previous master, when he saw that the odds were turning against Napoleon. At the beginning of the years 1810, the Napoleonic Wars continued to have repercussions overseas, especially on the other side of the Atlantic. First, because of growing tensions between the United States and the United Kingdom that had started in the previous decade. First, because independently from European matters, there was a growing sense in the US that Great Britain was hindering the expansion of the United States. There was Canada to the north, but also Britain supplied arms to Native Americans, and these weapons served in raids and skirmishes on the American frontier. Also, from 1803, Great Britain enforced a naval blockade against trade with France, and pressed sailors to join the Royal Navy, instead of working for merchants, including American sailors. All of this, plus the fact that most of the British army was in Europe, engaged in Spain or ready to intervene, so the timing looked good, this decided the United States to go to war in 1812. The war raged from 1812 to 1814 and ended without changes of frontiers. At the time peace was being negotiated and signed in 1815, the European situation had changed completely, and blockades were no longer an issue. Further to the south, the consequences of Napoleonic Wars left bigger marks, with revolutions multiplying in Latin America. These movements of independence would have probably happened sooner or later, because Spain and Portugal had declined so much that they couldn't keep controlling their very large empires. But the turmoil in Europe and the Peninsular War accelerated them. Independencies happened sometimes peacefully, like in Brazil. The Portuguese royal family had escaped to Brazil and established their capital there. After the defeat of Napoleon, they returned to Portugal. But the heir stayed in Brazil and declared independence. This helped keep Portuguese America intact instead of fractioning into multiple countries like Spanish America did. In Spanish colonies, the occupation of Spain and the abdication of the Bourbon let them organize multiple governments by local elites. In the 1810s, these autonomous governments took their independence, and wars ensued between revolutionaries and royalists who remained loyal to the Spanish crown. Eventually, the entire mainland took its independence and formed new countries, from Mexico to the north to Argentina and Chile to the south. Spain was left mainly with islands in the Caribbean, especially Cuba, and the Philippines on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. From 1810 to 1812, Napoleon's grip on continental Europe remained firm. Prussia and Austria had been diminished, and only the Peninsular War in Spain saw fighting for the French army. But in the east, with Russia, the situation was fastly deteriorating. You remember I told you earlier that Russia was uncomfortable from the start in its alliance with France, especially because of Poland. Each side wanted a semi-independent Poland it could control. Poland, the Duchy of Warsaw, was clearly in Napoleon's orbit, and the Russians had a hard time tolerating it. On top of this, Russia didn't want to support the Continental System and enforce the blockade, so Russia did not demobilize and kept its options open. Its reluctance to comply with Napoleon's orders and the understanding that sooner or later Russia would turn against him are the reasons why Napoleon decided to take the initiative, as he usually did. In the spring of 1812, at the height of his power, he declared war on Russia and began an invasion of his new enemy. Napoleon had never lost a campaign in Europe, and his army was bigger and more powerful than ever. Almost 500,000 men crossed the frontier. The Grande Armée had recruited 4 years, and with Napoleon's allies it was now a multinational force. 200,000 Frenchmen participated in the invasion of Russia, about 40% of the invasion force. The rest came from Germany, Poland, Italy, or the Balkans, but every European nationality was represented. At first, all went well. The army advanced unchallenged. It won minor engagements, but it soon appeared that the Russians were preserving the bulk of their forces. Napoleon commanded the center of the army. His left was faced with a high concentration of Russian forces, so instead of marching on St. Petersburg, the Russian capital, he advanced towards the historical capital and main city of Russia, Moscow, calculating that the Russians would have to go into battle to protect it, and they would be forced to negotiate peace if he took it. Just a few weeks into the invasion, though, his army began to suffer from the marchings imposed in the vast expanse of Russia, and logistical problems began to appear. Napoleonic armies lived on the land they crossed. They took harvests and all the resources they needed to keep moving without a heavy logistical system behind them. This worked very well in densely populated and fertile regions of Western Europe, but not well in Russia. All the more that the Russians used scorched earth tactics. They retreated and destroyed everything behind them, everything they couldn't take with them, so that Napoleon's army found no food, just burned villages and abandoned towns. Significant losses occurred because of this, and they were amplified by harassment from Russian light cavalry, more precisely Cossacks cavalry that fought on the side of Russia and could suddenly attack French columns before escaping thanks to their higher speed. 3 months after the beginning of the invasion, Napoleon reached the surroundings of Moscow, and at this point the Russians felt compelled to engage for real. The clash took place in the vicinity of Moscow, at Borodino. The Russians had large human resources, and it showed. In total, 250,000 men were involved in this battle, which made the Battle of Borodino the largest and also bloodiest single-day action of the Napoleonic Wars. There were at least 70,000 casualties. The French captured the main positions on the battlefield, but they couldn't destroy the Russian army. which made the battle undecisive. The Russians could retreat orderly, but the road to Moscow was now open, and Napoleon took it. But once again, the city had been evacuated and set on fire. It was destroyed for a large part when the Grande Armée took control of it. The Tsar still refused to capitulate, leaving the war in limbo. Napoleon had more or less prevailed, but not destroyed the Russian army. And now the winter was approaching. In October, with no victory in sight and obviously unable to supply hundreds of thousands of men, Napoleon had to abandon Moscow and begin to retreat to where he came from. The following 2 months were an ordeal for his men. The cold, diseases, guerrilla attacks, and hunger, all this decimated the ranks, and the retreat turned into a complete disaster. When Napoleon finally escaped the Russian winter, only 27,000 men remained. Almost 400,000 were dead or missing, and 100,000 had been captured. A large part of his army had effectively ceased to exist by the end of 1812. In 6 months, he had fallen from strongman of Europe to emperor in distress. He left what remained of his troops and traveled as far as possible to Paris, because he knew that news of his defeat was traveling fast across Europe, and he had no shortage of humiliated enemies waiting for revenge. A sixth coalition was being hastily formed, and the climax of Napoleonic Wars fastly approaching. Russia and the United Kingdom were joined by Prussia, Sweden, and Austria, that also their best opportunity ever at finally putting an end to Napoleon's domination. In 1813, larger armies than ever were raised on the side of the Allies, hundreds of thousands of men, and ferocious fighting ensued across Europe. Napoleon would not go down without a fight. He kept winning battles and could slow down his enemies on their way to France, like at the battles of Lützen or Bautzen in Germany. But he couldn't be everywhere. Elsewhere, his generals lost engagements against mainly Russian, Austrian, and Prussian armies. Most of the time they were strongly outnumbered because the French army couldn't compensate for the losses of the Russian campaign. The biggest clash took place at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, also known as the Battle of the Nations. Over 4 days, Napoleon with 200,000 troops tried to repel 360,000 Allied troops of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden. He was outnumbered, and the Allies had learned from the previous years of warfare, making his tactics less and less effective. The French army, that also contained a lot of German and Polish soldiers, hence the name Battle of the Nations, was decisively beaten, and from this moment on, all hope of winning had gone for Napoleon. He would now prepare to defend France. His power in France was crumbling in 1813 and 14. I told you in previous parts how he had risen to power by obtaining support from the elite in France, the wealthier classes, because he guaranteed that the rights and properties they had acquired during the revolution would be preserved. But these people never signed for never-ending wars, including wars that could affect them personally. In the 1800s, when there were mobilizations of soldiers in France, people could pay to avoid being enrolled, and this meant that the sons of the bourgeoisie were not forced to go to war. Their parents could afford to spare them this risk. Napoleon needed so desperately to find soldiers and throw them into his battles that after the retreat from Russia, mobilization was extended to ever younger generations and made compulsory. It could no longer be escaped, which made him increasingly unpopular. The population in France understood that the war was lost long before he admitted it. At the beginning of 1814, 500,000 Allied soldiers were now entering France from all sides, and he had only 70,000 soldiers left. He opposed them as much as he could, and even won more battles in the Battle of France. But the gap in manpower could no longer be reduced, and his grip on France was fading away. In April 1814, faced with a hopeless situation, he decided to abdicate. The victors immediately exiled him to Elba, an island in the Mediterranean Sea. They restored the French Bourbon to the throne, with Louis XVIII, the 18th, a brother of Louis XVI, the guillotined king, and they initiated a congress in Vienna to redraw the map of Europe after all these years of turmoil. The emperor who had imposed his will for 15 years had now fallen. But not quite yet. Napoleon spent less than a year on Elba. In March 1815, he escaped and landed in the south of France. Then began the last chapter of his epic, a period called the 100 Days, because he managed to return to power and make his enemies sweat once more. He marched to Paris, picking support as he went. The recently restored Louis XVIII was not popular at all, because with him came back a lot of the old order, a threat to the liberal reforms of the revolution. Liberal here is not in the sense of left-wing that it often means in America today. It is in the sense of classical liberalism, which was also a basis of the American Republic and the French Revolution. That is to say, individual liberty, equality before the law, and consent of the governed. With little popular support, Louis XVIII had to escape again for the second time after his exile at the time of the Revolution. And Napoleon took back the reins of France. He could do it thanks for a large part to the unpopularity of the restored regime, because he still had some popular support, but not the kind of enthusiasm he used to enjoy in the 1800s, especially from the bourgeoisie. The return of Napoleon was obviously synonymous with war for all his old enemies. So intense mobilizations resumed. But France was now vastly outnumbered at this point. Napoleon was able to raise 280,000 men. The allies of this new coalition, the Seventh Coalition, could field 700,000 and had plans for 1,000,000. Napoleon decided to strike first, as usual, and moved with a part of his army to Belgium, where the fate of his attempt at recreating his empire would be decided at the Battle of Waterloo. As you know, he lost it, and Waterloo was the last Napoleonic battle. He planned to eliminate a main British force commanded by Wellington before it could be helped by a Prussian army that was on the move. But Wellington was able to hold these positions long enough for the Prussians to arrive and to save the day. The battle was narrowly lost, and Napoleon had to return to Paris, where he realized that his situation was hopeless again. Hordes of Allied soldiers would overrun France again, and his own country no longer supported him. He abdicated for the second time, and this time the Allies would not let him escape. He was sent to his second and final exile to St. Helena in the southern Atlantic, where he died in 1821, aged 51. I already told you about various effects of Napoleonic Wars on Europe and the world along the three parts of this story. The changes in societies, wars and independencies in America, the spread of liberalism, which is ambiguous because Napoleon at the same time spread political change and was an old-style dictator, but the reforms on administration, in laws, the promotion of nationalism, the independencies, the abolition of all systems he accomplished, all of this left marks well beyond France. In Spain, in Germany, in Italy, in Poland. They were the seeds of more changes to come in the 19th century. Even though the victors tried as much as possible to restore the old order, they couldn't recreate the pre-revolutionary absolutism of the previous century. For countries like Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia, the conclusion of Napoleonic Wars comforted their power. Great Britain had not suffered destruction on its soil, and it had dramatically increased its navy and global influence during the wars. Its industrial revolution was demultiplying its economic weight, paving the way for Great Britain to become the leading power of the 19th century. Prussia was able to get back everything it had lost because of Napoleon, and would be well placed to unify Germany several decades later. Russia had been the main contributor to victory on land, and it confirmed its rise to a great power status of the 18th century. France was obviously on the losing side, and after centuries of being the most populated country in Europe, and attracting coalitions to keep it in check, it became just one power among others. The country had been drained of young men, and its frontiers put back to where they were in the early 1790s. In the 19th century, France no longer tried to expand in Europe, like it did in previous centuries. It remained rather unstable politically until it finally became a republic 60 years later, and it turned for expansion to colonialism outside Europe. An unexpected effect of the 1815 peace was also to put an end to the repeated wars with England and later the United Kingdom. From this moment on, there would be ups and downs, but the two countries came closer together and ended turning into allies at the end of the century. Napoleonic Wars also changed warfare. Armies became way bigger than before, and they now moved on large-scale theaters. This way of going to war lasted until the Second World War. To give you an idea of the change of scale in the size of armies, before the French Revolution, European countries had armies of a few tens of thousands of men. France reached an army size of 1.5 million in the 1800s. Britain grew its army from 40,000 to 250,000 between 1793 and 1813. These large armies needed to be equipped, which stimulated mass production of armaments and the nascent industry in Western Europe. In 1840, the remains of Napoleon were returned to France, and since 1861 they are kept in a sarcophagus in a crypt of Les Invalides under the Dome in the heart of Paris. This is where our journey ends for tonight, and we are now done with this story of Napoleon. Sleep well, or if you don't feel sleepy, you can pick another story from my library. I'll talk to you soon with another topic. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.